But my guest today is from the YouTube channel Thucydides, and I just want to say it's a fascinating choice of name for a YouTube channel.
Yeah, I picked it because I really admire the work of the historian
Mm,
Thucydides. He wrote History of the Peloponnesian War,
mm.
and he was one of the first historians.
Yeah, I really want to read the Peloponnesian Wars. Didn't he write a book about the barbarians as well?
Yeah, yeah, I've read some of that too.
I really want to read some of his works. But tell us about what you do on your channel and what you try to accomplish with your channel.
Um, my basic philosophy with the channel is basically to like bring the stories of history to life in this new digital age. Try to adapt those stories to this new format, so
Mm,
more people, young people especially, can appreciate these stories. So I try to make very high quality videos with animations and
mm,
pictures and funny jokes and stuff.
mm.
I just try to make my videos accessible while still keeping it very historically accurate and just telling good stories is what
Yeah,
I
and,
would say.
and I especially love the tire thing that you do. I've seen a lot of YouTube channel use this, but I love how you rank generals and rank emperors on your channel.
Yeah, I really enjoy making those videos.
And that's what kind of we're going to do today, except I won't be using the tier channel, but I don't know if you will, but today we're going to do a ranking of empires that existed throughout history. And each of us are going to have our own list. But what I want to focus on my list is their significance in history, how they influence history, and how they basically affected history being their presence is what I'm trying to accomplish on my list.
Okay. Yeah,
And
I prepared my own list as well
yeah, so we're
with
going to discuss back and forth why we put each empire on those lists. So it will be kind of a little discussion video for. I thought that would be really interesting.
Mhm.
So why don't we let you start with your top 10?
Okay, so for my number 10 empire, I have the Ottoman Empire.
Hmm.
Number 9, I have the Tang Dynasty of China. Number 8, I have the Spanish Empire. Number 7, I have the Maurya Empire. Number 6, I have the Mongol Empire. Number 5, I have the British Empire. Number 4, I have the Han Dynasty of China. Number 3, I have the Abbasid Caliphate. Number 2, I have the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And number 1, I have the Roman Empire.
Hmm. My list is the Danish Empire on number 10, but basically because I'm half Danish and it's not biased at all.
Nope.
And I have the Macedonian Empire on number 9. And on number 8, I chose the Aztec Empire. 7, the Umayyad Caliphates. And on 6, the Japanese Empire. On number 5, the Spanish Empire. And 4, the British Empire. Number 3, the Ottoman Empire. And 2, the Byzantine Empire. And 1, of course, the one and only, the Third Reich. I'm just kidding, of course, it's the Roman Empire number
I
1.
was a bit scared of that answer.
Yeah, I didn't hear from you when I sent you the mail, so yeah, I was. No.
A
It,
bit of a
of course,
scary
it's.
answer.
Yeah, man, of course, it's the Roman Empire on number 1. And why did you choose your number 10?
Okay, so my choice for number 10, the reason I put the Ottoman Empire at number 10 was, I guess, because
I was surprised by that, to be honest with you.
that it was so low.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the Ottoman Empire had a great start to its history. It had a very strong expansionist phase in its early history. It was very strong financially and administratively. It had a lot of economic power, a lot of military power. Uh, but during its later years, it entered a very long and painful phase of decline, and it was sort of subordinated to other powers of Europe. So I sort of knock it for that period, as well as for their systems where they, practice slavery and
Yeah.
stuff. I really like that, but
Fair enough. I mean, that was pretty common thing during that time, though, to be fair.
It was, yeah.
Oh, yeah, and for me personally, why I chose the Danish Empire at number 10, it's like I said, I'm half Danish myself and half Norwegian. I'm half Danish on my father's side, but it's also because if you want to check out, you can check out my episode. I did interview Kurt Vidar Jensen and his colleague Michael Redspo about the Danish Empire, and I read a book that they wrote about the Danish Empire, and it's actually quite significant in European history, and its influence in the and control of the Baltic Sea is fascinating. How they had such ties with the Pope, but I didn't put it higher because they weren't exactly the largest empire, and they didn't exact. I didn't feel like they should have any higher place on the list, but it kind of fascinated to me as a Scandinavian that we had this empire and that this had such significant part to play in European history.
That's fascinating. Can you give me a quick like overview of the Danish Empire and its history? Because I'm not too knowledgeable
Oh
on that.
yeah, so as you know, the Danish Empire. I'm not too knowledgeable myself. I don't want to try, but the Danish Empire basically they had, as you may know, they had the huge parts of England, and that's of course where we get the Danelaw. And they lost it, of course, to, I believe, I might be wrong in this, so somebody in the comments please correct me, but I believe they had lost it to William the Conqueror eventually, and the Normans, and the Anglo-Saxons. But they actually was talked about because they're significant. They had control of the Baltic Sea. They had, of course, Norway, and they had Sweden at one point, and Iceland was part of the Danish Empire. Greenland, of course, and Greenland is still a part of the Danish colony. So technically, and the Fair Islands. So technically, that kind of still is an empire. But they actually had colonies away in southern, not in the Caribbean, and African colonies as well. And the Pope had really good relations with the Danish Empire, because there were so many pagans at the time that it was a good place to convert into Christianity. And like I said, there was a point, and it didn't happen, but there was a point in time where they were supposed to marry a Byzantine princess, which didn't happen eventually, but there was talk about it. And yeah, because of the politic and the influence in the Baltic Sea, I kind of put it on the 10th because it's not the most famous empire in the world, but the influence, I feel like it's worth being on top 10, on my top 10 list.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd say that that's a very good case to put it on the list. Can you explain why you put the Ottoman Empire so high?
I just find Islamic history in general fascinating, and Ottoman history especially. You got so many great sultans like Mehmed II, and I'm not saying it's a necessarily good thing, but the Janissaries just fascinates me, and the Ottoman Empire is fascinating to me, and how they govern, and I kind of them were so tolerant, not really tolerant, but more or less tolerant, I suppose, to other religions. It's simply fascinating to me.
Hmm. I would say yeah, they were relatively tolerant.
Yeah.
I don't know about putting it above the Spanish and the British Empire though.
Mm.
Like, and I don't think the Ottoman Empire had the same like global
Yeah.
worldwide influence that those empires had.
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's fair enough.
That's why I didn't put it higher on my list personally.
Yeah, I probably should have switched with with the Spanish and British Empire, but the list is as it is. So
Mm, yeah, I like the Danish Empire though. It's interesting.
yes,
I'll definitely
it's
read more about it.
you should. The book actually is going to be available next year. I would highly recommend it. It's a fantastic book and fantastic read. And it's quite it's actually surprised me because coming into the Danish Empire, I was kind of naive because I thought it would be so kind of like just a Scandinavian thing, that they wouldn't have much influence at all really on European history or history in general. But when you read through the book, it's just wow. And not in the episode. It's not out while we record, but it should be out on the episode release. So I would definitely recommend checking. It's a two-parter, but where I interview both of the authors. So I would definitely check out that episode.
Okay, I'll keep my eyes out for that.
But yeah, what about your number 9 list?
I put the Tang Dynasty there because I would say the Tang Dynasty is probably the second greatest dynasty in Chinese history. It was a very cosmopolitan dynasty. It was a period where China was very engaged in world trade, like a leader sort of in the burgeoning global economy of the period. Like pretty big manufacturing capacity, very strong military, and fairly smooth bureaucracy, governmental structures, very advanced in a lot of aspects. There were a lot of things invented in China during this period as well. This is just a period where China was very strong, very influential on a global scale, and I think that's why I put it there.
Yeah, I'm not too strong on Chinese history, I'm afraid. I really want to learn more about Asian history because it's just equally as fascinating as European history, in my opinion.
Yeah, I noticed you didn't put any Chinese empires on your list, and I
Yeah.
feel like you probably should have put one of them or something at least on there.
Yeah, the reason is because I'm not too familiar with Chinese history, and that's why I just didn't put any Chinese, because I don't know enough about them to feel like can talk about it to put them there.
Yeah, that's reasonable. But there's a lot of good books out there
Yeah.
regarding these dynasties.
Yeah, definitely going to check it out, and I want to do more Chinese history and Asian history. So far, I've basically just done American and European history on my podcast, but I want to expand into both Islamic and Asian culture history as well, because it's just like I said. I'm gonna say this a lot, but it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is definitely very interesting, and it's always good to expand your historical knowledge.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I've been really focused. The thing is, I've been really focused on Roman history, so I've kind of been focused internally on Roman history, but I'm trying to expand and broaden my knowledge about both Eastern and Euro-Asian history as well.
Yeah, that's a thing with me too. I've focused a lot on Roman history as well.
So yeah, one of the reasons I put the Macedonian Empire is, even though Alexander did conquer the whole world, it didn't last very long. It just collapsed, kind of. So I didn't feel like it deserved to be higher up for that reason, because it collapsed basically right after Alexander died. So if I remember correctly, he didn't really name a successor either. So that's one of the reasons I put it down there so low on the list. It could have been a great empire. It had potential to become a great empire on the size, probably larger size than Rome ever was. But it just didn't work out with the governing, and they didn't get along, to put it that way. And that's one of the reasons I put it on so high on the list, because it's fell apart pretty quickly.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. Honestly, I wouldn't put the empire on the list at all because I don't think it deserves it. If you think about why that empire was able to exist at all, it was not just because Alexander was such a great general. It was also because the Persians before him had done the actual work of constructing the administrative and political structures of empire. And he just inherited that, which is why he was able to hold it together during his reign without actually stopping to do any work on it. He just kept going. He never did any empire building. The empire just kind of built itself. It was there before he was there. And I don't think the Macedonian Empire deserves any credit for any of that. So I wouldn't put it on the list.
Fair enough, but yeah, I just wanted to give it. It's sort of I kind of wanted to give it there because it conquered basically the whole world at the time, what they thought would be the whole world. So that's why I put it there on number 9.
I don't know about if it was the whole world. I mean, it was the Persian
As they
Empire.
say in history, as they say in the history books.
Yeah, but those history books are like Eurocentric, I would say.
Fair enough.
Like he never got to India, never got to China. He never
Yeah.
got turned around and went to Rome.
Didn't he
So
come to Pakistan though, if I remember correctly?
yeah, but the Persians were already there.
Yeah. Yeah, true. So I get what you're saying, but I just felt like it needed to be here because of the size. It's like like you said, it's technically not an empire because it collapsed so
Mhm.
quickly after his death. But I just feel like it should be higher on the list at least.
Hmm. Well, if you think it deserves a spot based off of size, why don't you put the Mongol Empire on here?
Hmm.
Why didn't you put the Mongol Empire on here?
Again, it's an empire I don't know too much about, but and one of the reasons I put the Macedonian Empire on the here is not just the size, but it did, like it or not, it did have an influence on history. I mean, we did get the Alexandria, which is still a city today, and the Library of Alexandria, which came later, of course. But it did have a significant influence on both Caesar and several other heroes of history. So that's one of the reasons I put it on there because of its influence on history.
That is actually a great point that I wasn't necessarily thinking of. Yeah, he did influence Alexander specifically. He influenced a lot of generals and conquerors after him, and also the things that he did to spread Greek culture
Mm,
and the destabilizing influence that hit the wars of his succession had on the entire region had massive implications for history.
yeah, and we got several cities that still is a part of our world today. That's from his comes from Alexander. So that's one of the reasons I put it on. I feel like it deserves, even though it's collapsed right after his death, it still deserves a spot on my list, in my opinion.
I think that's very fair.
So yeah, I want to learn more about Alexander, and I intend to do an episode about him eventually. But
Mhm.
yeah, that's what I one of the reasons why I put it on there.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
So yeah, what about your eighth list?
Uh, my number 8, I had the Spanish Empire.
Mm,
I put the Spanish Empire at number 8 because, again, the Spanish Empire was very big and it was very powerful, but it was also managed very badly. It had terrible administration, and despite the fact they had so much money, they ended up running out of their money because they kept fighting so many unwinnable wars in Europe against a
yeah,
bunch of enemies. Also, they were very bad at using their resources to like improve
yeah,
their empire really. Like despite the fact that they had such a head start and such an immense advantage in natural resources, they managed to fall behind in development uh, with the rest of Europe by the year 1700. So
yeah.
basically, they just choked a massive lead, and I don't think that they deserve a super big spot despite their massive influence on creating the world economy.
And I should have switched with the Japanese and Spanish, but and they didn't keep the colonies very long either. They didn't govern them very well.
They did not, yeah, they didn't really. I mean, obviously, their empire was exploitation on an insane scale beyond anything previously achieved in history, which is impressive, but it also ended up being unproductive in the end because they just extracted all the gold and silver
Yeah.
and left pretty much nothing.
Yeah, that imagine what South America could have been like today if they actually governed correctly.
Yeah, they really did not do very much work to improve the lives of people in the colonies there.
So yeah, I there any other reasons you did like internal what about Spain itself and the Spanish Inquisition?
Right, that, yeah. And also the failure to modernize, the failure to
Yeah,
keep up with the rest of the colonial
yeah.
empires.
And inbreeding doesn't help either.
No, definitely not.
So yeah, I put try to put the Aztec Empire on top eight because, and again, it's technically not an empire, but I kind of it's fascinating, and this I'm gonna be like Spock here and say fascinating enough, but yeah, it's just interesting to me how they govern into things and ruled. It was basically a utopia before the Spanish came along. I mean, sacrificing 80,000 people, it kind of shouldn't be higher on the list because of that.
That's an interesting placement. I don't know if I would call it a utopia because yes, Tenochtitlan was a very beautiful city with
Hmm.
very advanced civil engineering, and their empire was obviously
It
very
was
strong.
supposedly supposed to be a utopia. I mean,
Yeah, but
they didn't have money. They didn't have anything like money didn't exist in the Aztec Empire until the Spanish came along and wanted all the gold and steal it from them.
um, is
If
that
I mean, if I read,
true?
I don't, I'm not too sure, but I remember watching something where it said this, and don't quote me on this, but again, I'm not too sure. I think it was too sure about this because I'm a little bit fussy on the Aztec Empire, but like to me, they are again fascinating people, and the religion is super interesting, and the board games they had, it's interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've watched documentaries and I read some articles. I'm not sure if that thing about currency is true. Like, I obviously they didn't have metal
Yeah,
currency like they had in Europe, but I don't know if they had another medium of exchange that sort of resembled currency.
yeah. I mean, again, the way that they did things with religion, where we actually became a god and work among the people for 1 year just to be sacrificed. I mean, you gotta admit that's pretty fascinating to learn about how they do this, how they treat the religion, and how they govern people with.
Yeah, it's also really impressive, I guess, for these people to have built such a great empire to create such great feats of engineering without use of pack animals
Yeah,
or proper metalworking. It's very interesting how they managed to do that.
I would love if I'm able to travel again to go see the pyramids in person, just to be near there and watch their just imagine what it was like to be standing in front of the pyramids watching the sacrifice. I mean, it would have been horrible, but I mean, it would just fascinating to see and picture what things was like when you're near such a historic significant architecture. And I'm an ancient architecture geek, which is one of the reasons why I love the Romans so much. But that's one of the, I know that's one of the reasons I want to go to see the pyramids, because of the architecture that they made.
Yeah, there's fascinating ancient architecture everywhere.
Yeah, and I keep saying this, that you look at a skyscraper today, and it won't look as beautiful as, let's say, the pyramids of the Aztec in 1,000 years. It just won't hold up well, unlike the Aztec pyramids, which will probably still stand there 1,000 years from now. And like, let's say a modern skyscraper in New York, it just won't be as, it can be ugly in, let's say, 30 years if people don't use it. But then, and meanwhile, like ancient churches or pyramids, they still gonna stand there and stand the test of time.
Um, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. It's just about aesthetic appreciation at that point. And I
Yeah,
don't think there's anything necessarily special about ancient buildings that make them more aesthetically appealing. But like I think modern skyscrapers are fantastic too. And I feel like
oh yeah, like
they'll become historical monuments the same way that the pyramids of the Mayans
I'm
are.
not saying it's. I'm not saying they're ugly. I think there is beautiful buildings today as well, but I'm just saying I don't think they will hold up as well if you don't maintain it.
Well, the Mayan pyramids actually, you should see pictures of them when they were first discovered. They were not maintained for 1,000 years, and they did not look very good. The
Fair
thing you see
points.
now, the thing you see now, has been heavily restored for the eyes of tourists.
Fair
So
point. Fair point.
yeah,
But yeah, it's the Aztecs is definitely someone I wish to discover more of and learn more about their religion. Like I said, it's fascinating to me, and yeah, I definitely wish to discover more about them.
yeah, that'd be wonderful. I want to travel more to see more of these historical artifacts and
Oh yeah.
sites. Yeah.
So yeah, well, your number, I believe you're the number 7 now.
Yeah. So your number 7 was the Umayyad Caliphates.
Yeah.
So do you mean the Umayyad and the Abbasid, right?
The Mayan from, I believe, I don't have to look up. I don't remember the year. I believe so. They're two different aspects empires, right?
There were yeah.
I mean, the Mayan, the first one, I think.
Just the first one?
Yeah, just the first one.
Okay.
756 to 1031. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So why did you put that one there?
Well, again, it's the influence of the empire and the Islamic expansion. Again, I want to say that I don't condone what they did to expand, and of course they did atrocities as well. But there, and we talked about this in my episode actually on my episode on brief history of science, where we talked about how their astronomy, that the research in astronomy and literature influence us still today, and that's one of the reasons. Because the Islamic people were fantastic in the Golden Age. They were fantastic astronomers and scientists, and it's not, you can't deny that. And when you learn about Islam, and I feel like Islamic history is misunderstood, and I'm not saying that they're governed perfectly, but the size and the expansion. Because remember that Islam was pretty new at this point, and how they conquered Spain and basically the African Mediterranean on the African side. It's just it's and again I said take a drink every time I say this word, but it's fascinating to me. The Umayyad Caliphate.
Yeah, I agree. It's very impressive that Islam managed to spread like that so fast, and that the Arabs managed to conquer so much in such a short time. And also the fact that they created a lot of good stuff out of their conquest.
Yeah. I'm not saying that the governing could be questionable, like how they. I mean, that was in the Ottoman Empire as well. That if you weren't Muslim, you could had to pay the extra tax to be left alone, and that they didn't want to let people be converted into Islam because they got the extra tax from those who were Muslim. So they kind of were a little aggressive at that point, and other governing as well. But yeah, that's one of the reasons I didn't put them higher on the list, because the governing was kind of questionable, I suppose, and it did fall eventually. But and I want to recommend a YouTube channel here that's called Al-Mutadi Mayit, I believe.
Mukarama.
Yeah, that's it. It's a
Yeah, I've
fantastic.
watched those videos.
It's a fantastic channel to learn more about the Umayyad Caliphates if you're interested in learning more about them. And that's how I learned about them, through his channel. And we are talking about doing a collaboration as well in the future, hopefully.
Interesting.
But yeah, it's just I find Islamic history fascinating, and Umayyad Caliphate definitely goes under that category. And yeah, I feel like to understand Islam, you need to understand their history as well, and having more or less the amateur level. I'm not an academic, but you feel like you kind of start to understand that how misunderstood in the West that Islam actually is. That people don't really understand what it's about.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of narrative going around that Islam is a violent religion, that it's a religion built on conquest, founded on conquest.
Yeah,
Yes, there's plenty of conquest and violence in Islam's history.
but so did Christianity. Remember,
the same applies for all religions. Yeah, there's plenty of that in all religions' history. And again, you have to remember that even though Islamic empires were built upon conquest, their conquests were not brutal and genocidal like many other conquests throughout history. And also, the work that the Muslims did in the lands that they conquered very much improved the quality of life for people there.
Yeah,
And the things they did to endorse learning and science, all of it. just really advanced human civilization.
So if you want to understand Islam, you need to understand its history as well. And it's just, like I said, it's interesting, if not as interesting
You
as.
dodged the word there. I saw that.
Yeah, yeah, don't notice. And it's not as interesting as European history and Christian history, in my opinion.
Absolutely. So I love the placement there on that list. My
Yeah,
number
why did
7
you choose
was
the Abbasid Caliphate?
I put the Abbasid Caliphate up there because I sort of value what they did more than the
Hmm?
Umayyad, because the Umayyad came first and they did the conquering, but
Yeah,
the Abbasid did the work of actually cementing the empire, creating the Islamic world of the medieval period and afterwards. And they, endorsed science, they sponsored learning, and they
yeah.
created institutions for all these things. They founded libraries, and they basically cemented Islam's permanent existence in this
Yeah,
region. So I think that gets them a very, very high score in influence.
yeah. It was definitely one of the golden age of Islam during the
Mhm.
Abbasids, and that's one of the reasons I respect them so much, because their endorsement of science and their and when how they actually endorsed it, unlike Christianity at the time, who denounced, more or less denounced it. I'm not saying everyone did, but you know,
Yeah, Catholic Church was not being very helpful.
yeah. So that's one of the reasons I respect Islam so much, because of the, I would say, openness towards science and prosperity towards knowledge.
Yeah, I value very highly empires that manage to create peace, prosperity across a vast area
Yeah,
and a lot of people. And I think the Abbasids did that. They did that very much. They created a connected Arab world across the Mediterranean, kind of similar to what the Romans did with the Pax Romana. They
yeah.
created a world brimming with trade and
How do you
learning.
think Romans would react to Islam if they saw it as the Abbasid Caliphate?
I mean, the Romans did, right? They're the Byzantines. So,
Yeah, I mean, an ancient Roman, if you will, technically.
uh, hmm.
Pagan Rome, to put it that way.
I believe that the pagan world would be troubled again by the rise of a monotheistic religion like Islam,
Hmm.
but I think Roman emperors would very much admire a lot of the things that Arab rulers were doing during this period.
Yeah, yeah, same. Yeah, I think I can do my number 6 list, which is the Japanese Empire. I
Hmm.
don't just want to do European empires. I want to broaden that as well, and it's at least put one Asian empire on the list. And having I've said this before on previous episodes, but I read John Toland's book on and watched a few documentaries on this empire, and again, the way that they managed to go from an isolated nation until becoming an empire in such short time, it's really, you gotta respect that, how quickly they modernized, and their what's the word for it, the motivation for becoming a modernized country after being kind of forced from an isolated nation to become part of the modern world. And I respect that tremendously, that how quickly they've managed to get an army, factories, get help from Europe, from German designers, from German and American intellectuals to help them become a modern country. I respect that.
That's reasonable. Um, I would disagree with your placement though, simply because of
Mm,
the things that the Japanese Empire did
fair
in the
enough.
in the pursuit of building their empire. They committed innumerable war crimes, an insane
Yeah,
amount of
true.
atrocities,
They didn't treat China
absolutely
very
brutal.
kindly.
They didn't treat anybody very kindly. You know what they did in Korea as well,
Yeah,
the things they did in Burma and
yeah,
Indonesia and all of these countries in Southeast Asia, East Asia, everywhere that their empire went, they would abuse, they would exploit, they would rape, they would kill, they
Yeah,
would
true.
do horrible things. This is like half a step down from the Nazis. Okay,
True.
so I would not put this on the list.
But in a way that the Japanese Empire is kind of a creation of the Americans, if you look at it that way, because kind of forced the Japanese to not go from isolated country into a modernized world.
Nobody really forced imperial ambitions onto Japan necessarily.
Not imperial ambitions, but like modernized.
Yes, I mean if
And
they just
being
became,
modernized, they kind of see what they kind of saw what other countries were doing, and they said, "Hey, I wanted a part of this."
yeah, and they did it in a way that was worse than any other country managed to do it.
Fair point.
I don't
Fair
find that
point.
necessarily impressive.
What I do find impressive though is how quickly they managed to modernize, and
That
that's one of
is
the
very
reason that I
impressive.
put that that's one of the reason I put it on the list, so high on the list.
That is impressive. I will give you that.
I think they did win the Russo-Japanese War. They did actually treat those person. That might be an exception, but they did treat the. I believe if the sources are right that I read, did treat the prisoners with kindness. That might be one exception.
That was most definitely an exception. Yeah, I still very much disagree with this placement, but I will respect your choice.
Hmm? And what about you? What's your number 6?
But number 7, I actually missed
7.
this. It was
Sorry. I'm sorry. I thought we were
yeah,
on number. I thought the bus. I forgot to.
yeah.
My bad.
Number 7, I have the Maurya Empire of India.
Hmm.
This is the first empire to unify India under the Chandragupta and later Asoka.
I actually never heard of this empire. So could you tell me
Are
what
you
the
serious?
word? Yeah,
Yeah.
no.
It was the first empire to unify India. Basically, the Indian subcontinent has always been one of the most prosperous and powerful regions
Hmm.
on the planet, but this empire was the first one to unify the region and make it self-sufficient and strong and a major player on the world stage. Uh, this empire is pretty religiously tolerant under the policies of Ahsoka. Also, major participant in trade, kind of helped start the Silk Road
Yeah,
during the period that the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire were also rising.
yeah.
So this empire, in terms of historical influence, very great. One of the great empires of the ancient world.
Hmm. Yeah, sorry, I told you that.
I'm surprised you didn't know
Yeah,
about it.
yeah. No, actually, when you said think about it, mention it. I think the Chinese generals had an episode on the Mauryan Empire and the Indian. Either them or it was in Invicta. I don't remember. Somebody had an episode about the Mauryan Empire and the unification of India.
Mhm.
But I just
I
don't
think I've
remember
seen
who.
that. I've seen that video before. Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't remember the channel's name.
Yeah. Interesting. Like historical anecdote.
Yeah.
One of Alexander's generals, Seleucus, actually fought a war with
Mm,
Chandragupta while he was
fascinating.
founding his empire. Alexander went into India right at the moment where the Maurya Empire was rising.
Mm,
So if he was a couple years late, he would have ended up fighting a war there.
fascinating. I thought you said that you had. I'm really sorry because I thought you said that Abbasid Caliphate was your number 7.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's what's your number 6 list,
My
or was
number
it?
6, yeah. My number 6 is the Mongol Empire.
Yeah.
I had to put this one on here because it was second biggest empire in history, the biggest contiguous land empire in world history, and that's not a small accomplishment. Obviously, this
Oh
empire
yeah.
was built through a great deal of conquest, a great deal of atrocity. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah. That's
estimates.
what, like you said, mentioned with the Japanese Empire. That I was. Why did you put
I
those?
put
It's not kind of the same thing. They committed plenty of atrocities, rape, and murder as they came
yeah,
across.
of course. But I put the Mongol Empire on here because of its role in facilitating a cross-continental trade through Eurasia, basically reestablishing the economic connections on a large scale that were lost after say the collapse of the antique Silk Road.
Yeah.
For the first time, there was that transcontinental trade, which that exchange that the Mongols facilitated with their Pax Mongolica, as some historians have called it, it really accelerated the advancement of the European and the East Asian worlds. So
Didn't they get into almost into Romania at some point, I believe?
they conquered a lot of land. They from like Japan to Hungary or something. And they did it with a lot of atrocities, but again, they also contributed a lot to the world in a way that I don't think the Japanese Empire did. I think
Fair.
the Japanese Empire was very heliocentric, and by that I mean it was very centered around the Japanese mainland. The entire imperial effort was focused on exploiting their conquered regions for the benefit of Japan, whereas the Mongol Empire, they weren't necessarily like that. They were more hands off with administration. They were loose with regulations on trade, and they allowed local authorities to sort of maintain their positions in a way that the Japanese definitely did not.
Fascinating. So, I thought you want to do the next one?
Yeah. Number 5, you had the Spanish Empire. We talked about that. Why do you put the Spanish Empire higher?
So, simply because, again, of the influence, like I said in the beginning, that's what not a lot of focus, why I put empires on the list, and they're significant in history. Like we talked about, they didn't govern very well, but you gotta admit that the Spanish culture that's still that is the one of the world languages we have today. I'm trying to learn Spanish right now, actually, but that's beside the point. But
How's it going? How's that going?
Très bien.
I think that means good.
Yeah.
I think it means good.
But anyway, piano is good. But anyway, again, the influence and how they managed to rule basically a third of the world at that time. It's quite impressive to me how they had cities from Mexico until all the way down to Argentina, even though they didn't govern very well and committed atrocities as well. But yeah, I respect how large they became, and even though they lost at a point, I just feel like they needed to be here, and I didn't really have any other place for the Spanish Empire. But it's one of those that you feel like it has been on the top 10 simply because its influence and the Spanish culture has on the South American continent. I just wish they would have governed better when they left to help the South American countries prosper, to become better countries, maybe in an alternative universe they have, but who knows, que sabe, as they say in Spanish, who knows. But yeah, I feel like and my love for Latin American culture as well, and what it brings is one of the reasons I put it so high up.
Yeah, as far as influence goes, there's only a few empires throughout history that can rival the Spanish Empire.
Yeah.
First truly global empire, they had bases in the Philippines and the Indian Ocean as well as the Americas. So they were the first ones to sort of create that world circuit of trade.
Yeah.
And they really facilitated the expansion of the world economy during the 1500s.
Yeah, and they were ruled by a Habsburg at some point. I don't remember the year.
Yeah, Charles V.
And we did get the Spanish Inquisition skits from Rowan Atkinson too, so
yeah,
there's that.
Yeah, but it's hard to ignore that the Spanish Empire laid the groundwork for what a global empire was supposed to be.
Yeah.
It was actually the first empire. They say that the sun never sets on the British Empire.
Yeah.
The first thing that they said that about was actually the Spanish Empire. The saying was originally about the Spanish Empire.
Yeah. And how the Philippines is named after King Philip of Spain. Its influence is hard to ignore.
Absolutely.
In world history. So that's one of the reasons I put it so high up.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I'd probably move it a bit up.
Fair enough.
My number five is a British Empire. Yeah, my number 5 was the British Empire. I think.
Yeah, actually, that's my number 4, so we can kind of put that together, I think, so we can talk about why did you put that on your 5.
Yeah, I put the British Empire high but not as high as some other people would. And I'm thinking about why I did that. I think obviously the British Empire was perhaps the most dominant empire in world
Yeah,
history. It was the greatest global empire ever, and it was a modern
yeah,
empire. So it was probably the greatest in terms of overall power compared to any
yeah,
of these. But I can't necessarily put it higher than the ones I have here because I think I value ancient empires more.
yeah, same.
That might be a bit of a bias that I have, but
Yeah, no,
obviously
I 100% agree.
if you go farther back in history, there's obviously going to be more influence because influence expands over time.
Yeah,
Uh, and maybe I'm just a little bit more uh wary of endorsing colonialist empires
yeah,
simply because they have such like their actions, the actions of colonial empires like the British, the Spanish,
yeah,
and the Japanese, their actions and their conduct in much of the developing world have lasting consequences in the modern day. So
yeah.
it's a little bit more difficult to endorse their actions or
Mm,
celebrate them.
true. And one of the reasons I put mine on the British on four is because, like you said, English is like English is one world leading language, and we thought they did conquer basically the whole world, to put it that way. No one has conquered as much as the Britons has, I believe.
Yeah.
And you got English people that speak English today in the world because of it. You know, Canada speak English and America speak English because of the British Empire, and they've basically conquered the known world from India to Africa. I mean, they didn't treat them very kindly, not necessarily, but we got the Industrial Revolution because of the British Empire, and it's just an interest. I feel like it should be as high as it is because of the much significant that the empire has on history.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. The legacy of colonialism and the legacy of the British Empire specifically is a very mixed bag, but it's a very big bag. It's a very big
Yeah,
bag.
we shouldn't ignore the atrocities committed by the British with like the slave trade and the slave.
Famines in
Yeah,
India.
and the way when Churchill basically stole grain from India because for the World War II and the Indian starves, for
Yeah.
example, we shouldn't ignore those things, but at the same time, it's hard to ignore. And of course, should mention the Middle East and the British influence on Middle East that is
Yeah.
like it is today because of the British Empire, which made me think Josh maybe should have put it higher on the list when I think about it. But
Mhm.
like again, the influence of politics and of basically how we got English as a world language and what it, and how the size of the empire is what
Yeah.
I put it so high.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of influence, it's undeniable that the British Empire should go very
Yeah.
high on this list.
Again, I want to ask you, what do you think the Romans would how do you think they would view the British Empire since they conquered Britain at one point for several hundred years? How do you think they would have viewed the
Mm.
British Empire?
I think uh it's difficult to say because the British Empire was sort of an inheritor of the Roman legacy, but at the same time, sort of an inheritor of German
Yeah,
legacy through the Anglo-Saxons. Also, the British Empire was a maritime empire and a trading empire. I don't know how the Romans would feel about that because they were never the most fond of the open sea. But the trading part and the facilitation of trade, the facilitation of peace, prosperity,
yeah,
movement, and that kind of thing that the Romans absolutely adored. I think they would love that too. They
yeah.
would very much admire what the British had done.
I think they would respect the size too of the empire. They became
Of
larger than
course.
the Romans ever did.
Yeah, yeah. They very much expanded the world's horizons.
So yeah, what about your number four?
My number 4 is the Han Dynasty of China.
Hmm.
I have this here because it was the first Chinese empire.
Yeah.
I have this on here for the same reason that I have the Maurya Empire. I just have it higher because the Han Dynasty lasted longer.
Yeah.
It basically unified China. I mean, technically, there was the Qin Dynasty before the Han Dynasty, but it didn't last very long. And the Han Dynasty did the real work of making China a very strong, centralized state,
Yeah.
directing its resources toward foreign conquest and trade, basically creating the first strong Chinese state, a tradition that would sort of be echoed by all future Chinese dynasties.
Yeah. Yeah, Chinese empires is something I definitely want to study more because I kind of respect how China is today, even though it become today that it's still a world power in today's today in the modern world as well, and the influence of Chinese history and China is again fascinating to me.
Yeah, good word, good word.
And we did get Sun Tzu as well
Yeah.
from China, which again is influence on military history and generals is magnificent.
Hmm. Yeah. China has a very storied military tradition, if that's your vibe.
Yeah, yeah, and we got Confucianism as well.
Philosophy, yes, it's
Yeah,
always been a source of admiration from the West.
yeah. So Chinese influence it's hard to deny through history.
Impossible, yeah. That's why I have it high. What's your number 4?
That was the British Empire.
Oh, right, we discussed that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I put the Ottoman Empire on number 3 because again, I said I'm really interested in Islamic history, and it's just I'm gonna say this word again. Sorry,
Yeah, you're good.
fascinating to
Hmm.
me because of the misunderstanding because of certain groups that we have in the world today, and that's why I'm trying to understand Islamic history to see if it's really as brutal as people say. I mean, it's interesting the influence of the Ottoman Empire in our Turkish world today, and the Janissaries is pretty cool. I mean, it's not necessarily a good thing, but I find it interesting to
Nice.
to learn about the Janissaries, and I intend to want to do an episode. And the sultans like Mehmed II and Suleiman the Magnificent is just two emperors. That is sorry, sultans that you can the influence of those sultans is hard to deny in history.
Yeah,
I mean,
Mehmed specifically is very fascinating. Did you know that he
and
invaded Italy?
hmm,
Did you know that Mehmed invaded Italy?
yeah, but it failed though.
I mean, it failed just because he died.
Yeah,
It was actually succeeding when he died, which is interesting. He could have marched on Rome,
yeah.
which is terrifying.
Imagine what world history would look like if it actually managed to march on Rome.
Oh yeah,
I mean, the Constantinople, and the fall of Constantinople itself, it's one of the most important. I think one of the most important parts of his Eastern history as well.
absolutely.
So that yeah, again, that is definitely going to become a future episode. The fall of Constantinople, and it's yeah, Ottoman history. It's interesting. Have you seen the TV show about the 80s? So there is a Turkish TV show actually
Hmm.
about an Ottoman. So one of the last Ottoman sultans in 1876, I believe it's called. Yeah, in 1876. Don't remember the sultan's name.
I think it was Abdul Hamid or something.
Yeah, that's him. Yeah, it's a Turkish series. It's quite good actually.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. What's it called?
I don't remember the name. I remember watching a few episodes, but it's really good.
Yeah,
I don't send you what I remember.
yeah, find that.
But yeah, it's the Ottoman Empire and the harem. It's just the mystery of the Ottoman Empire. It's interesting. And again,
Have you seen this Netflix series about the Ottoman Empire?
yeah, that's one of the reasons how I found out about the Ottoman Empire actually, and I
Yeah,
just found I was taught by it, and I just wanted to learn more about the Ottoman Empire
yeah.
because of it. And
That show is very good.
another channel I would like to recommend because to learn about the Ottoman Empire's Hikmah history, which is another good, really good channel if you want to learn about Islamic history.
Yeah.
So yeah, I believe what's your number 3?
My number 3 was the Abbasid Caliphate. We
Yeah.
talked about this one, but I'll just restate it. Basically, I have this one here because, like you, I think I value influence in history a lot, especially positive influence. Positive influence on a large scale. And I think the Abbasid Caliphate qualifies for that 100%. The way that they created the Arab world and made it into like the absolute center of prosperity throughout
Yeah,
the entire globe during this period. It's very admirable what they did.
absolutely. And you want to go talk more about this, or you want to go to number 2?
Yeah, we go to number 2.
Yeah, you can do the others.
All right. My number 2 was the Persian Empire, the
Hmm.
Achaemenid Persian Empire.
Interesting. Why?
I've been doing a video series on the Achaemenid Shahs of Persia,
Which I would
Kings
really
of
recommend
Kings.
checking out. It's really good.
Yeah, it's about the Kings of Kings of Persia, basically
Hmm.
the ones who founded and expanded the Persian Empire. I try to convey through the series how revolutionary and different the Persian Empire was from its predecessors, from anything that existed in the world at the time. It was the largest empire by far in the world, and it also the Persians conquered in a remarkably tolerant way. Um, they very rarely killed civilians. They very rarely destroyed cities. They would very rarely enslave conquered peoples. They had
Yeah.
not much slavery, not much exploitation. Of course, there's always that kind of stuff when you have a conquering empire. But if we're doing this on a grade, like on a gradient, the Persians were definitely towards the very tolerant, very nice side of, atrocity committing empires. And
They almost
also,
conquered Greece too. They almost
yeah,
conquered Athens.
that's funny. Yeah, they almost did that, but unfortunately, that's one of the only times in history, where like weapons systems and military strategy
Yeah.
actually impacted history in like a very,
Hmm.
very significant way. In most other cases, right, like with the Roman case, it's not because the Romans had better like equipment or like better tactics or whatever. It's mostly just
Yeah.
because the Roman economy and the Roman demographics were so strong that it just overwhelmed everything. But
Yeah.
like in that situation, even though the Persian demographics were so much stronger than the Greeks, despite the fact they were outnumbered
Hmm.
2 or 3 to 1 in every battle, their weapon systems and their tactics, the phalanx and the long spears and the heavy
Yeah.
armor, they were just too powerful, and they actually changed history.
Yeah. True. But it wasn't it. I believe it was Crassus who did. They tried to conquer Mithridates at one point.
Yeah, no, not Crassus tried to conquer the Parthians.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
I forget the Roman general's name. I mix up sometimes.
yeah,
There was a Roman general who tried to conquer. I think was it It wasn't Pompey.
Pompey succeeded in defeating Mithridates.
Yeah, that's it. There was a general before him that tried but failed. I remember, but I don't remember his name.
Lucullus
That could be
definitely.
it. Yeah.
No, Lucullus, he won victories against
Hmm.
Mithridates, but he didn't like finish him off, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, about the Persian Empire, I wanted to talk more about this.
Yeah. Of course.
Um, the Persian Empire basically set the precedent for, I don't know, the Roman Empire, I guess the Macedonian Empire, the Maurya Empire, the Han Dynasty. Sort of set the standard for a world empire. It took the idea of empire to a much larger scale than previously before,
Yeah.
and it also did it in a very respectable way.
Yeah.
The administration of the Persian Empire, really efficient. They're a remarkably hands-off type of empire, but they still managed to keep it together for 2 centuries. Very
Yeah.
impressive.
Yeah. I'm surprised you didn't have the Byzantine Empire on their list. To be honest.
I have the Byzantine Empire as the Roman Empire. I don't consider them different things.
Fair enough. I just had them as two separate entities, kind of, because most historians, I believe, consider them to be two separate entities. But I chose the Byzantines number 2 because of its historical significance and influence on history. I mean, apart from the Crusades, we did get Constantinople, which is one of the most important cities in history, and we had so many great emperors. And the influence of the Byzantines is hard to deny when you see how the Theodosian walls was built, and some of them still stand today in Istanbul, as and how they managed to conquer almost back into the Romans, back into the full size of Rome. With I believe it was Justinian.
Yeah.
Justinian
Launched the Reconquest.
Yeah, and how there was a story where there was an earthquake, and the emperor got the fans of the sport. Sport was so
Chariot
important.
racing.
Chariot racing was so important part of Byzantine politics, and how we managed to get the fans to rebuild the walls again. That wouldn't happen. I believe it would happen anywhere else, and we got the Crusades, which isn't a good thing. But again, the impact of the Crusades in history and how the Byzantine history influenced our modern world and how they managed to stay alive until 4053. I mean, they basically were the sick man of Europe at that point, but still, its influence and how we got the first female historian, Anna out of the Byzantine Empire is I'm gonna say that, yeah, fascinating to
Yeah,
me.
she's very interesting. Have you read her works?
I want to. I haven't yet, but I really want to.
Yeah, the way she describes and relates like court intrigue, it kind of gives you a sense of why we call very complex and convoluted things Byzantine.
Yeah, and the influence on Byzantine history and how they managed to stay alive so long. I respect that. They
I'll say the
basically kept
resilience is impressive. Yeah.
they basically carried on the Rome, so it didn't really fall. And I agree. I kind of consider them the same thing, but I just feel like a lot of people don't. So that's why I wanted to
Yeah.
separate Rome and Byzantine Empire in this
Yeah.
case.
I think it's very fair to separate them. Like you said, most historians will actually make that distinction, even if they'll consider them like political continuity. They
Yeah,
will actually call them different things because they were pretty different things. Like the Roman
yeah,
Empire was the Mediterranean world, while the Byzantine Empire was kind of a regional power within a larger Mediterranean world that was more dominated by
yeah,
the Islamic caliphates. And that's sort of the reason that I don't think the Byzantine Empire necessarily deserves to be on this list.
hmm,
Because if you look at the span of Byzantine history, like from the fall of the West to the invasion of the Arabs,
yeah,
the Byzantine Empire was a great superpower on the scale of the Romans. But after that, they were basically reduced to regional power status, and they only managed to regain a little more of their glory, but
yeah,
never to the extent that they had before. In terms of influence, I don't know how much they necessarily had, especially on a global scale, because of the fact they were confined to the Mediterranean and they were
yeah,
just one of many big powers in the Mediterranean. So, like the Byzantine Empire was more of a regional level empire to me rather
yeah.
than a world empire that deserves to be on a top 10 list. I
Fair
don't know.
enough. I mean, like we said, by 4053, they basically were the sick man of Europe because they basically just had Constantinople left at that point.
Yeah, and they were pretty reduced in power even by the year like 800 or something. I mean, just look
Yeah,
at a map. Look at a map. It's kind of sad, but yeah.
yeah. And you want to do a few honorable mentions before we go to number one?
I don't have any, but do you have any?
I feel like like Prussia needs an honorable mention. for unifying Prussia,
Mm-hmm.
for unifying Germany, and the influence it has on German politics and how the Germany became a unified country.
Yeah, yeah, I would say that's a good choice of an empire to highlight.
Yeah, I don't want to put, this is not an honorable mention, but didn't put the Holy Roman Empire because I don't really like the Holy Roman Empire that much.
Holy Roman Empire was not a real empire.
I don't consider it to be either, and I don't feel like it's too much of a mess to be.
Yeah, it was more of a title
Yeah,
for prestige purposes because there was very little that the actual title conferred to you in terms of power.
yeah. And again, I want to put Habsburg on Empire on an honorable mention list as well, because again their influence in the Austrian politics, and they also had the Spanish influence at one point too. They had a Spanish king on.
Habsburg Empire is difficult because there was never a unified
Yeah,
Habsburg Empire. The closest they got was under Charles V, where it was a personal union between like Spain and Naples
yeah,
and Austria, and all these things were ruled by one person.
sure.
But after that, even though they were the same dynasty, they were sort of split off. It was
Yeah,
never actually a unitary empire, so I don't know if that would actually count on the list.
I suppose that's why I put it on an honorable mention list
Yeah, but
instead.
definitely at its peak under Charles V.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean it had the Spanish Empire too in that, so
yeah.
definitely.
That's my honorable mentions, I suppose.
Let me think of some honorable mentions. Let me see. Uh, I suppose the Mali Empire would
Yeah,
deserve an honorable mention. Mansa Musa, he's become famous
yeah,
on online articles for being quote unquote the most famous or the most rich person in history,
yeah,
right? For having so much goddamn gold. But that's pretty cool. I think that would deserve it. One of the
yeah,
great African empires. I guess also maybe the Egyptian New Kingdom,
yeah.
I guess, for breaking new ground.
Yeah, I was considering putting Egypt on there, but I just wasn't sure.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a bit far back in history, but
Yeah,
still
but
definitely.
yeah. So you want to go to number one, and don't worry, it's not the Third Reich. Of course, it's ancient Rome.
That's good. Ancient Rome. So we have ancient Rome. We both have that, the Roman
Yeah.
Empire at number one. What are your reasons for that?
Well, again, it's the influence of the empire. We got the Romans languages because of the Roman Empire, like Spanish, Portuguese, French, and even Romanian, as part because of the Roman influence. And they actually as well influenced the Danish Empire at some point because they did collaborate with Denmark when as hiring them as mercenaries for
Yeah,
against the Germans, but not just the fascination of how they managed to grow from one little city state until a massive empire, and how they managed to grow, rule the Mediterranean for almost 1,000 years. It's impressive.
absolutely. Yeah. I think what I value most in ranking the Roman world would be, like I said before, the establishment of peace and
Yeah,
prosperity and just improving the lives of citizens overall by making them safer and making their lives more stable.
yeah,
I think Rome did that very well for several centuries. Started to fall apart at the end, of course, like all empires do, but during the few centuries of its core prosperity, I think Roman people overall experienced greatest prosperity in human history up until that point,
yeah,
and it
and
was very sustained.
yeah, it had its fair share of mad emperors, which made it even more interesting, and to learn about his emperors to so-called mad, crazy. Is it true? How much of it is true? How much is biased? And
Yeah,
Julius Caesar, which is one of the biggest men in history, to put it that way.
yeah. the work the Romans did to create a truly connected economy within the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
The immense scale of the Roman economy is just breathtaking.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just imagine what it would be like to be a Roman, to watch being in Rome. I mean, just see Colosseum, a battle in Colosseum. It would have been spectacular.
Yeah. And of course, we should avoid idealizing Rome.
Oh yeah, I was going to say that too. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, just look at
Slavery.
Carthage, for example. When they burned.
Yeah. Insane atrocities as well. Julius Caesar apparently killed 1 million people in Gaul.
Yeah,
I don't think that's true, but probably not too far off from the number. Also, the Roman slavery
yeah.
was horrible system, but
I mean, Rome was built on slaves, but I
yeah,
believe so was every other ancient world
yeah.
empire at that
But
time.
Rome took it to an industrial level with
Yeah.
how they used slavery to fuel their economy, which is probably the biggest stain on the Roman reputation, I guess,
Hmm.
that maybe 15% of the population was enslaved.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
for a vast majority of people, it was terrible because they had slaves working in mines, they had slaves working on plantations. They basically had a mix of slavery from throughout history.
Yeah.
So,
Wasn't it Marius Crassus who said that you're not rich enough until you don't have to work yourself, that your slaves can do all the work for you.
yeah, yeah,
But then again, you got people like Caligula and you got people like Nero and Sulla, who just really fascinating to read about and to. God, I need to learn when to change my vocabulary, but they're
all good. It's
just
all good.
really interested in how the Roman army worked so well, and that's why I keep coming back to Rome, because it's just there you never learn about it. You can never run out of subject to learn about it when it comes to ancient Rome.
Yeah, the Roman Empire just achieved so much in terms of scale, organization, and prosperity. Just that combination, as well as
Yeah,
longevity,
yeah,
scale, prosperity, longevity, all this stuff. Rome did very well. And obviously, it did so on the back of a slave system, which
yeah.
you have to recognize. But in terms of influence, as you said, undeniable, probably the most influential empire in history.
I mean, just look at Mussolini, how he embodied himself after Caesar, 1,000 years after.
Yeah, and monarchs throughout history have done that.
Yeah, people still quote Cicero today in
Yeah,
protests.
yeah, the Roman legacy lives on today.
And how Latin language still is used in for scholars and in medicine and in flowers and very basically basically everywhere in fiction it inspired fictional languages inspired people still not really, I wouldn't say it's a dead language, but not really in a sense.
I mean, dead language just means that there's no native speakers
Yeah,
left,
yeah.
but and there's no native speakers, but it's still a very exciting community, I guess. There's this YouTuber called Polymathy.
Oh, I love him. I love him. I would love to have him on the podcast.
Yeah, he's fantastic. He's amazing. He reads
Yeah,
and speaks ancient Greek and Latin.
that's
Wonderful.
impressive.
Wonderful, yeah.
So yeah, you want to add anything else, or are you happy with the list that we've presented so far?
I think happy with this. Yeah, it's been a great discussion with you.
Absolutely, same.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to my podcast, do you have anything you want me to plug on the social media or anything else you want me to put in the description for my podcast?
You can just put my channel there.
Yeah. So my name is Alan. If you're listening on my end, this has been That Aged Well. We are under Instagram under That Aged Well. You can find my podcast wherever you can find podcasts on Spotify, on Apple Podcast, wherever, and we are also on YouTube. So check us out there. And then my name is Alan. I'll see you next time.